Hello everyone and welcome back to the Prado Museum for another of our weekly sessions in English here with the American Friends of the Prado Museum. You know, you can always go to the website of the American Friends of the Prado Museum and the Fundación de Amigos del Museo del Prado to find out more about the work that we do, about how we support the museum, the different projects that we're working on, and also see how maybe you might be able to get involved. Today we're going to be looking at this painting, the recognition of Philopoemen, by two celebrated Flemish Baroque painters, Peter Paul Rubens and Frans Snyders. This painting is a unique, a powerful example of artistic collaboration, and it's a great opportunity to learn about the creative process of each, and specifically the creative process of Peter Paul Rubens, which is exactly the subject of the exhibit that we are in right now, this exhibit of Rubens' workshop. So let's think about these two artists first. Peter Paul Rubens. Peter Paul Rubens was born in 1577 in Antwerp, and as we know, he was enormously successful all throughout Europe. And we can recognize Rubens' paintings for their dynamic compositions, for his vibrant brushwork, and for these large dynamic figures that he paints that brings life to the painting. Frans Snyders was born around the same time, also in Antwerp, and so he was Rubens' contemporary. And while he might not be as famous today as Rubens is, he also had a really lucrative career, and he was specialized in still life painting and animal painting. He had this amazing ability to render wonderful textures and details with astonishing realism that really set him apart. Now, from technical studies and from a preparatory sketch that does exist by Rubens, we know that Rubens oversaw and he led this project. So Rubens was able to capture the grandeur of human form in dramatic narratives by painting these figures. While Snyders, who excelled at these details of the still life elements, painted the food and the animals. So this division of labor allowed each artist to play to his strengths and make this magnificent composition of the recognition of Philopoemen. So what is the subject of the recognition of Philopoemen? Well, this tells us a story of the life of Philopoemen, who was a Greek general and a statesman, and we know of his life from the stories of Plutarch. Plutarch was a historian, he was a writer, he was a philosopher, and he wrote a text called The Parallel Lives. And in The Parallel Lives, he compares the lives of different famous, celebrated figures from Roman history and from Greek history. And he tells the life of Philopoemen. He tells us about the life of Philopoemen, but he's less interested really in historical accuracy, even though he was a historian. He was more interested in the moral virtues of his protagonist. And so in his story, in his account, he really highlights that the general, that Philopoemen, was somebody who was very modest and very humble, even despite his really important status as a great military leader. Philopoemen was austere, he was disciplined, he was humble, and these were considered to be elements or qualities that were essential for a great soldier and for a great leader, for a great general. And he taught his men to live this way as well, to be austere, to require little, and to live simply. And Rubens, who was so well versed in classical culture, chose a very specific passage from Plutarch's text to capture Philopoemen's moral character. Philopoemen was invited to a banquet in his honor, and as we know, Philopoemen, who was so humble and so simple, appears to this banquet. He shows up to this banquet dressed very humbly, dressed very simply. And so when he shows up at the door, a woman answers, and she is preparing the banquet, and she thinks that Philopoemen must have sent a servant to help with the preparation. So she immediately puts her guest to work chopping wood. And she doesn't realize that this really is Philopoemen who's come to the door. A few minutes later, her husband comes home and realizes what has happened. He realizes the mistake, that she's mistaken their guest for a servant. And this is the moment that we see here. We can see the surprise, the embarrassment of the husband, and the reverent attitude of his wife, who's bringing her hand to her chest, apologizing. Of course, in typical Baroque fashion, this is all about the moment, the revelation, the surprise, which is probably another reason that Rubens would have chosen to represent this moment of the story. And so in this painting, we can see Rubens' fascination with the human condition, with moral virtue, with the classical world. He was so adept at conveying complex emotional, moral narratives through his paintings. And here he's really contrasting the grandeur of the general's position, the humility of his attitude, of his morality, and of course the grandeur of his position seen in the abundance of this banquet here. This luxurious, abundant banquet that has been painted by Snyders. Now, the genre of still life painting really emerged in Europe in the final years of the 16th century, and this is a kind of painting that challenged previous ideas of what was considered worthy of to paint, what was a worthy subject for paintings. But still life paintings were typically small, and they were only of objects. They had no human figures, no clear storytelling. But this composition, which was designed by Rubens, the whole thing was designed by Rubens, is enormous. And the still life becomes an integral part of the narrative. This meticulous representation of food and animals prepared for the feast offers us a visual representation of the abundance of Philopoemen's status, but also his indifference to that kind of wealth. In this painting, Rubens really has taken still life painting to new levels, to new heights. It's completely elevated. So it's a beautiful painting, and it's a fascinating example of an artistic collaboration between two wonderful artists, Peter Paul Rubens and Frans Snyders, and a window into their creative process, which is exactly what you can explore more of here at this exhibit of Rubens' workshop. So thank you for joining me today, and we'll see you again next Wednesday.